I've told this story maybe 4 times in my life. Each time somebody asks me to slow down at the same part, the part where he stepped forward. And each time I tell them, I stepped forward too later, but I want you to understand something first. I didn't step forward when it mattered. He did. So let me tell it right from the beginning, the way it actually happened. Not the way the recordings show it, because the recordings cut off half a second too early and they missed the sound. And it was the sound that I still hear, if I'm honest. On quiet nights on the long hauls, when the drive is humming and everybody else is asleep in their bunks. I hear that sound. Let me back up. My name doesn't matter much for this. I was a cargo hand, still am some days. Back then I worked the lower rings of a place called Harrogate Transfer. If you've never seen a transfer station, imagine a wheel the size of a small moon, spinning slow, with docks stacked 12 deep along the inner rim. Ships come in from 40 different worlds. Some of them you've heard of. Most of them you haven't. And in the middle of all that, you've got creatures walking around who breathe 6 different kinds of air. So the whole place is carved into zones, and every zone has a hard seam where the atmospheres don't mix. Humans got the cheap zone. We always did back then. This was maybe 9 years after first contact, so we were still new. Still the strange ones. You have to remember, to most of the galaxy we were a rumor that turned out to be true. A young species. A loud one. We came out of a nowhere corner of the arm, and the older powers didn't quite know what to make of us. Some of them thought we were dangerous. Some thought we were a joke. Most of them just thought we were beneath noticing. The Empire fell into that last group. I should tell you about the Empire. The Vashan conquered. That was the proper name, but everyone just called it the Empire because that's what it was. 900 worlds. A history so long that when they talked about their own founding they used numbers I couldn't hold in my head. They were an old, cold, careful people. Tall. Taller than us by a full head. Gray-skinned, with these narrow vertical eyes that never seemed to blink at the same time. They moved slow and deliberate, like every step was a decision they'd already made 100 years ago. And they did not like disorder. That was the thing about the Vashan. Order was practically their religion. Everything in its place. Every creature in its rank. They ran the biggest trade lanes in that whole sector, and they ran them clean. And when a Vashan delegation came through a station, the station cleaned itself up out of pure nervous instinct. We had one coming through. That's what set the whole day apart. A conquered inspection convoy, 3 ships on a swing through the border stations to review compliance. Compliance with what none of us on the lower rings ever fully understood. Tariffs, standards, the shape of the paperwork. Bureaucrat stuff, way above a cargo hand's pay. But when the word came down that the Vashan were docking, the whole station tightened up like a fist. The station master went around personally. He came down to our ring, which he never did, and he stood on a crate and he told us, I remember this, he said. For the next 2 cycles, you are invisible. You do your jobs, you keep your heads down, and you do not, under any circumstances, cause a scene in front of these people. They can shut the station down with one signature. Do you understand me? We understood. Or we thought we did. Now here's the man. His name was Renner. Elias Renner, and I want to be careful describing him because it's easy, after the fact, to make somebody into a hero, to make them bigger and cleaner than they were. Renner wasn't clean. He was a bulky, tired man in his 50s with a bad shoulder and a worse temper before his second coffee. He'd been a soldier once, way back, in one of the little brush-fire wars we humans had with each other before we ever left home. He didn't talk about it. He worked the same ring I did, loading and unloading, and he kept to himself mostly. And if you'd lined up every man on that station and asked me to pick which one would end up in the Concord's own records, I would not have picked him. He had a way of watching things, though. I noticed that even before. He'd be pulling a pallet and his eyes would be somewhere else, tracking a movement across the deck, some small thing nobody else clocked. A kid climbing where a kid shouldn't. A crate stacked wrong. He'd fix it without a word and go back to work. Old habits, I figured, from the soldier days. Turned out those old habits were the whole story. The alien child. I need to tell you about the Ilsu. The Ilsu were a small people, small in number, small in size. They came from a water world way out past the Concord's edge, and they weren't a power, they weren't a threat. They were just a quiet, gentle species that mostly kept to their own reefs and traded a little glasswork, and let the big powers argue over the shipping lanes above their heads. An Ilsu adult stood about chest-high to a man. They had smooth blue-gray skin, almost like a dolphin's, and wide dark eyes, and these delicate frills along the sides of their necks that fluttered when they were frightened or excited. When they spoke, it came out soft and musical, almost like singing, and the translators struggled with it, so mostly you just watched their frills and their hands and you figured out what they meant. There was an Ilsu family on the station that cycle. Refugees, technically, though nobody used that word out loud. Their reef had been caught in a dispute, not even a war, just a dispute, a border being redrawn by people who'd never seen the water, and a few families had gotten out ahead of it and scattered across the lanes looking for somewhere to wait it out. 2 of them ended up on Harrogate, living in the transient quarters near our ring, keeping to themselves. Frightened, I think, all the time, in that way that people get frightened when their whole world has been taken out from under them, and they're standing in a place where nobody speaks their language and nobody particularly wants them there. And they had a little one. The child's name, as close as any of us could pronounce it, was Senna. She couldn't have been more than 5 or 6 in their years, whatever that translated to, small even for an Ilsu. Curious the way small children are curious everywhere in the universe, which is to say completely and with no sense at all of danger. Her frills were always up, always fluttering. She'd wander to the edge of the transient quarters and stare out at the great churning deck of the station with her mouth open, and her mother would come and gently pull her back, and 5 minutes later she'd be at the edge again. I'd seen her a dozen times. We all had. She was hard not to notice. There's something about a small child in a big frightening place that gets under everybody's skin, even hard old cargo hands who claim not to care about anything. Renner had noticed her more than most. I know that now. At the time I didn't think about it, but looking back I'd catch him sometimes when the family passed through the ring, watching Senna the same careful way he watched everything. And once, just once before any of this, I saw him crouch down to her level and hold out a little folded thing. Some scrap of packing foil he'd twisted into the shape of a bird. Just handed it to her. She took it and turned it over and over in her little webbed fingers like it was the most amazing thing she'd ever seen, and her frills went wild, and her mother scooped her up quick and hurried away, nervous, apologizing with her hands. Renner just nodded and went back to work. I didn't think anything of it. That was maybe a week before the Vashan came. Okay, the day itself. I want to slow down now, because this is the part that matters, and I want to get it right. The Concorde convoy docked on the upper rings, of course, nowhere near us. The delegation came out in their long gray robes and their slow, deliberate walk, and the station master and his people met them, and there was ceremony and speeches, and the whole polished song and dance that the upper rings do when important people come through. We heard about it secondhand, over the calm chatter. Down on our ring, we just kept our heads down like we'd been told and moved cargo and waited for the 2 cycles to be over. But the inspection wasn't just a ceremony. It was a walk-through. The Vashan wanted to see the whole station, top to bottom, to certify compliance, and that meant at some point the delegation was going to come down through the lower rings. Through our ring. Word came about an hour ahead. Clean up, look sharp, be invisible. The station master's voice on the comm sounded like a man being slowly strangled. So we cleaned up. We squared away the loose cargo, we swept the deck, we lined up looking as respectable as a bunch of cargo hands can look, which isn't very, and we waited. And here's the thing nobody planned for. The transient quarters where the Ilsu family was staying, those opened right onto the main thoroughfare of our ring, right onto the path the delegation was going to walk. Nobody thought about it. Nobody thought about the refugees at all, honestly, because that's what happens to refugees. They become part of the background. They become something you don't see anymore. But they were there, right there, on the route. And little Senna was at the edge of the quarters, the way she always was, staring out at all the sudden activity with her mouth open and her frills up. And her mother was distracted, packing, because there'd been talk that the transients might get moved to make the ring look tidier for the inspection. And in the middle of all that packing and worry, for just one moment, nobody was holding the child's hand. I watched it happen, and it happened so slow and so fast at the same time, the way these things do. The delegation came around the curve of the ring, 6 Vashan in gray, tall, unhurried, terrible in their calm. Behind them, the station master and his people, sweating. And behind them, and this is the part I didn't understand until later, a conquered security detail. Because a delegation like that doesn't walk anywhere without protection. 2 of them. And Vashan security is not like our security. Ours carry stunners and try to talk you down. Theirs carry weapons that don't have a low setting. And they carry them because in 900 worlds of history, the conquered has learned that the appearance of absolute control is the thing that keeps absolute control from ever being tested. They do not tolerate anything unpredictable getting close to a delegate. Anything. And a small blue-gray shape came running out onto the thoroughfare. She was chasing the foil bird. I found that out afterward too. She had it in her hand, Renner's little bird, and she'd been playing with it at the edge of the quarters, and a gust from an air cycler had knocked it loose and it went tumbling out onto the deck, out toward the delegation, and she went after it. Just a child chasing a toy. That's all it was. That's all it ever was. But you have to understand what the security detail saw. They saw an unidentified small creature break from the crowd and rush the delegation at speed. And they reacted the way they were trained to react. One of them stepped in front of the delegates. The other raised his weapon and leveled it at the running child. I want to describe that weapon for a second so you understand. It wasn't a gun the way you'd think of a gun. It was a long gray rod, and along its length these blue lines lit up when it powered, and there was a sound it made, a rising whine that I have never heard from any human weapon and hope I never hear again. It's a sound your body understands before your mind does. Everything in you goes cold and still and says, "That is death powering up, move." The child kept running. She didn't understand. How could she? She saw her toy on the deck. She was 5. And the whine climbed. Now here's me. I want to be honest about me, because it's the only way any of this means anything. I froze. I stood there on the edge of the thoroughfare with a manifest in my hand, and I froze completely. Every part of me understood what was about to happen, and every part of me did nothing. I have thought about that a great deal in the years since. I've made my peace with it mostly. I was afraid. Afraid of the weapon, yes, but more than that, and this is the ugly part, the part I've had to sit with. I was afraid of the Empire, afraid of causing a scene, afraid of that signature that could shut the station down. The station master's voice was still in my head. Be invisible. Don't cause a scene. And so when the moment came, that fear had its hand around my throat and I did nothing. Most of us did nothing. I looked later at the faces of the others in that crowd in the recording. All of us. Frozen, human and non-human both. 24 people watching a child about to die and not one of us moving. Except one. Renner was closer than me, maybe 10 meters. He'd been squaring cargo near the thoroughfare when it started. And I saw him, I was looking right at him. I saw the moment it registered on his face, and there was no calculation in it. That's what I remember most. There was no weighing of consequences. No fear, no thought about the Empire or the signature or being invisible. There was just a man seeing a child in front of a weapon and something older than fear taking over. He moved. For a big man with a bad shoulder, he moved like the years fell off him. He crossed that distance in 3 strides, and he did the only thing there was time to do. He didn't grab her and try to run. There wasn't time. The wine was at its peak. He got between them. He put his own body between the weapon and the child, and he wrapped himself around her, turned his back to the Vashin, curled down over her small blue-gray shape like a wall, like a shell, like every instinct in every parent in the history of everything. And he braced. The security officer fired. Here's the sound. It wasn't a bang. I keep expecting people to expect a bang, and it wasn't. It was a crack and a hiss together, a sound like the air itself being torn, and a flash of blue-white that lit the whole thoroughfare, and I saw Renner's body jerk, saw it take the hit across the back and shoulder, saw the impact drive him down over the child. And then it was quiet. That's the quiet I still hear, not the shot, the quiet after. Everything stopped. The whole ring stopped. The delegates stopped. The station master stopped mid-word with his mouth open. And in the middle of the thoroughfare there was a man curled over a child, and he wasn't moving. And for one long, terrible, endless moment nobody in the universe knew what to do. Then the child made a sound. A small, thin, frightened sound from underneath him. Alive. She was alive. He'd taken all of it. Every bit of it had gone into his back and his shoulder, and he had given her nothing, kept all of it for himself, and she was alive underneath him making that small, frightened sound. And Renner, and I still don't know how, I've talked to medics about it and they still don't fully understand it. The human body is a stubborn thing. Renner moved. He lifted his head. His face was gray, and his eyes weren't focusing right, and there was blood at the corner of his mouth. And he looked down at the child underneath him, this little Ilsu girl with her frills flat against her neck in pure terror, and he did something I will never forget. He smiled at her. A small, broken, reassuring smile, the kind you give a frightened kid to tell them it's okay, it's over, you're safe. And he got one word out, just one, in that soft, ruined voice. SHH. That's all, SHH, it's okay, I've got you. And then he sagged. Now the Vashin. I told you they were an old, cold, careful people. I told you order was practically their religion, and that they did not tolerate anything unpredictable. And a human had just thrown himself in front of a conquered weapon, in front of 6 conquered delegates, to shield an alien child of no political value whatsoever, an Ilsu refugee, one of the small, quiet, nobody people of the galaxy. By every rule they had, this was a disaster, a scene, a violation of everything they'd come to certify, and I braced myself in that frozen moment for what the Empire would do, for the second officer to fire, for all of us to be arrested, for the signature that shut the station down. That's not what happened. The lead delegate, the eldest, I found out later, an official whose title translated roughly to something like First Witness, which is a strange title, and I'll come back to it. The lead delegate raised one long gray hand, and the security detail froze. The one who'd fired was already resetting, already bringing the weapon back up, because there was still an unidentified situation on the deck, and his training said neutralize it. And the old delegate raised that hand and made a sound, a single low tone, and the officer stopped like he'd hit a wall. The weapon lowered. The blue lines went dark. And the old Vashin delegate walked forward. Slow, deliberate, terrible in his calm the way they all were. He walked out onto the thoroughfare, past his own security, past his own delegation, and he stopped in front of Renner and the child, and he looked down at them for a long, long time. Nobody breathed. Then he knelt. I have to tell you, I found out later from a Vashin I'll get to that this was not a small thing. A Vashin delegate of that rank did not kneel. There were words in their language for the shame of kneeling, for the loss of station it implied. In 900 worlds of their history, the number of times a first witness had knelt to anyone could be counted on one hand. They stood. Everyone else knelt to them. That was the order of things, and the order of things was their religion. And this old gray official knelt down on the deck of a filthy cargo ring, in front of a dying human and a refugee child, and he lowered his head. Then he looked up, and his narrow vertical eyes found the child, still shaking underneath Renner's failing body. And he did something with his hand, a slow gesture, palm turned up and out. I didn't know what it meant. I learned later. It's an old gesture, older than the Concord itself, and it means, roughly, I see you. You are witnessed. You are under my regard. It's the thing they do for their own, for Vashon, for the recognized and the ranked and the important. He did it for an Ilsu refugee, child on a cargo deck. And then he spoke, and the translators caught it, and it went out over the comms, and this is where the whole galaxy started to hear about it, because this part was recorded and this part survived. He spoke in that slow, deliberate way, and what he said was, "Move the human quickly. He is not to die on this deck." Now everything happened at once. The station master came out of his paralysis and started shouting for medics. Our people rushed forward now, finally, now that the Empire had given permission, now that it was safe, we all rushed forward. And I hate that it took that, I hate that we needed permission, but that's the truth of it. Medics came running. The child's mother came screaming out of the transient quarters and snatched her daughter up and held her so tight, rocking, making that soft musical Ilsu keening, her frills flat and shaking. And Senna was crying and alive and clutching that stupid little foil bird in her fist the whole time. She never let go of it, not once. And they got Renner onto a stretcher. I was one of the ones who helped lift him. I want you to know that. When it was finally safe, when the danger was past, I stepped forward and I got my hands under his shoulder, the wounded shoulder, and I felt how much of him the weapon had taken, and he was so heavy, dead weight heavy, and I thought, I did nothing. When it mattered, I did nothing, and this man did everything. And now I'm carrying him, and it's too late to be brave. He was still conscious. Barely. His eyes found me as we lifted him, and there was almost a laugh in them, this dry, pained flicker, and he said, and this is the last thing he said to me, on that deck, he said, "Didn't even get the bird back for her." And I said, "She's got it, she never dropped it." And something in his face eased. That's the only word for it. Eased, like that was the thing he'd needed to know. They rushed him to the medical ring. And the Vashon delegation, this old empire, this cold, careful people who'd come to inspect us and certify our compliance and find us wanting, they went with him. Let me tell you about the medical ring, because I wasn't there for all of it, but I've pieced it together from the medics and from the records, and from one long conversation I'll tell you about at the end. The Vashon convoy carried a medic. Of course they did. And Vashon medicine was 1,000 years ahead of ours. When the delegate said Renner was not to die on that deck, he'd meant it, and he made it happen. The Concord medic went into our little medical ring and took over, and did things to keep Renner alive that our people didn't have the equipment or the knowledge to do. Concord technology spent on a human cargo hand, on a nobody. It didn't fully work. I'll be honest with you because Renner deserves honesty. The wound was catastrophic. The weapon had done things inside him that even Concord medicine couldn't undo, not fast enough. But it bought him time, days instead of minutes. It bought him enough time. Enough time for what, you're wondering? Enough time for the whole thing to become what it became. Here's what I mean. The recording of the thoroughfare, the child running, the weapon rising, the man throwing himself over her, the old delegate kneeling, that recording got out. I don't know exactly how. Station recordings aren't supposed to leave the station, but something like that doesn't stay in one place. Within a cycle it was on every feed in the sector. Within 3 it was across the whole arm. Human feeds, Ilsu feeds, and this is the part nobody expected, Vashon feeds. Concord feeds. The Empire's own channels, which almost never showed anything that wasn't polished and official and controlled. They showed it. They showed one of their own weapons rising against a child, and they showed a human stopping it with his body, and they showed a first witness kneeling on a cargo deck. And they did not spin it and they did not bury it. Because, and this is the thing I learned, the thing that changed how I understood the whole empire, because of what that title meant. First witness. I'd thought it was a bureaucrat's title. It wasn't. Or it was, but underneath the bureaucracy it meant something old and real. In the deep root of Vashan culture, going back before the conquered, before the 900 worlds, the Vashan had been a people obsessed with one question: what is worth preserving? Their whole long cold order was built on that question. Everything ranked, everything in its place, because the fear underneath it all was chaos, was waste, was the loss of anything that mattered. And a witness, a first witness, was the one whose ancient duty was to look at the galaxy and mark what was worthy, to see and to certify this. This is worth preserving. This has value. This is to be kept. That's what he'd come to do to us, to Harrogate, to humanity in a way. To look at us, this young loud species in our cheap zone with our cargo rings, and decide whether we were worth anything, whether we had value, whether we were to be kept or swept aside like the transients when the ring needed tidying. That was the inspection. That was what compliance really meant underneath all the paperwork. And he'd found his answer on the thoroughfare. Not in our paperwork, not in our tariffs, in one tired old cargo hand who put his body between a child and death without stopping to ask whose child, without stopping to ask what it would cost him, without stopping to ask whether it was allowed. I told you the Vashan valued order above almost everything. Here's what I didn't understand until later. They valued it because they were afraid of what happens without it. They'd seen it. In their long history, they'd watched worlds fall to chaos, watched people turn on each other when the order broke, and they'd built their whole cold empire as a wall against that. And they'd started to believe, over the centuries, quietly, in a way none of them said out loud, that this was simply what all peoples were. Selfish underneath, held in check only by order. That was their bitter old wisdom. That was why they'd stopped kneeling to anyone, because they no longer believed anyone was worth kneeling to. And then a human, with no order over him at all, no rule requiring it, nothing to gain, threw himself over a stranger's child. Do you see it? Do you see what he showed them? He showed them they were wrong. He showed them that the thing they'd built their whole empire to protect against, the selfishness underneath, the every creature for itself, wasn't the bottom of things after all. That underneath the chaos, underneath the disorder they feared so much, there was something else. Something that didn't need a rule to make it act. Something that would give everything for a stranger for no reason at all, except that the stranger was small and afraid and about to be hurt. The old delegate knelt because he was witnessing it, doing his duty, marking it this. This is worth preserving. And what he was marking wasn't just one man. It was us. I got to see Renner once more before the end. They let a few of us in. Me because I'd helped carry him and a couple of the others from the ring, and the child's family, and standing quiet in the corner of that little medical bay, the old Vashan delegate himself, the first witness, just standing there watching the way his whole title said he should. Renner was awake, weak, wrapped in conquered equipment that was keeping him going, but awake and himself, that dry temper still in his eyes even then. The Ilsu mother came to him first. She couldn't speak our language and he couldn't speak hers, but she took his hand, his big scarred cargo hand's hand, in both of her small webbed ones, and she pressed it to the frills at the side of her neck, which I later learned is the most tender thing an Ilsu can do. It's what they do with their own children, and she keened softly, and there were no words that needed translating. And then little Senna. They lifted her up so she could see him, and she was shy now and frightened of all the equipment, and she hid her face for a second against her mother. And Renner, with what little strength he had, reached over to the tray beside the bed, where somebody had said his few things, and there, I don't know how it got there, One of the medics must have found it and kept it. There was the foil bird. A little battered now. He picked it up in 2 fingers and he held it out to her. The same as before. The whole thing coming full circle. A man holding out a folded scrap of foil to a child who thought it was the most wonderful thing in the universe. She took it. And this time, her mother didn't pull her away. This time her mother let her stay, and Senna leaned over and pressed her small forehead against Renner's, the way her mother had pressed his hand to her neck, and her frills came up, not flat with fear now, but up, fluttering, the way they went when she was happy, and she made a soft musical sound that the translator, for once, caught perfectly. It said, "Friend." Renner closed his eyes. He died that night. Peacefully, they told me. In his sleep, with the conquered equipment easing him down, which is more than most cargo hands get, more than he ever would have gotten on his own. But that's not the end of the story. There's one more thing I have to tell you, and it's the thing that made me finally understand what he'd done, the full size of it, and it's the reason I've told this story 4 times and will keep telling it. After Renner died, the old delegate, the first witness, asked to speak with those of us who'd known him, and we sat with him in that quiet medical ring, humans and one old gray Vashan who could have shut our whole station down with a signature. And I asked him, I don't know where I found the nerve, maybe grief burns the fear out of you. I asked him why he'd knelt, why the conquered had shown the recording, why any of it when by all their rules it should have been the opposite. And he was quiet for a long time. They're always quiet for a long time. And then he told me about the title, First Witness. He told me all the things I've just told you about worth and preserving and the old fear of chaos. And then he said something I've carried with me ever since. He said it slowly, deliberately, in that cold, careful voice that wasn't cold at all anymore, not underneath. He said, "We have watched 1,000 species. We have certified worlds and rejected worlds. We believed we knew the shape of all living things. That underneath, when the order falls away, each creature reaches for itself. We built everything on this belief." He looked at the empty bed. Your man reached for the child. There was no order over him, no rule. Nothing to gain and everything to lose, and he did not weigh it. We saw that he did not weigh it. There was no time to weigh it, and so we saw what was underneath in him, when there was no time for anything but what was underneath. And then he said the thing. We had forgotten that this was possible. A whole empire, and we had forgotten. Your species is young and loud, and it does not know its own place, and it breaks every rule we have. And underneath, when the order falls away, and here his narrow eyes did something, closed slow, one and then the other, underneath, it reaches for the child. He stood. I came to witness whether humanity was worth preserving. I will report that it is, not because you are orderly, you are not, but because you have shown us something we lost so long ago, we had stopped believing it was ever real. And he made the gesture again. That old one, palm up and out, I see you, you are witnessed, you are under my regard. He made it to the empty bed. And then he made it to us, to all of us, the cargo hands, the nobodies in the cheap zone. Then he left and the convoy left and Harrogate went back to being Harrogate. But nothing was really the same after that, not for us, not for humanity in that sector. The conquered opened lanes to us that had been closed. Ilsu refugees started finding homes in conquered space, quietly, no announcement, but it started right after. And every so often on the Vashan feeds, that recording still plays. The child running, the weapon rising. The man throwing himself down over her, keeping all of it, giving her nothing. They named it in their language, the whole event. They gave it a name the way they name the things they've decided to preserve forever. The translation is imperfect, but it comes out close to the day the wall learned to kneel. I think about Renner a lot. The bad-tempered old cargo hand with the bad shoulder who I would never have picked, who taught an empire something it had forgotten, who died holding out a foil bird to a little girl and telling her SHH, "It's okay, I've got you." And I think about the fact that I froze, that when it mattered I did nothing and he did everything. I've made my peace with it mostly. Here's how. The Ilsu family, they got out. They found a home, a real one, on a green, quiet world in conquered space because of what happened that day. And a few years back, word reached me, cargo hands hear things. We go everywhere. Word reached me that the girl, Senna, was grown now. Or nearly. And that she'd taken up a trade. She'd become a witness. The first Ilsu ever to hold that Vashan title. The first of the small, quiet nobody people to be given the ancient duty of looking at the galaxy and marking what was worthy, what had value, what was to be kept. And I thought about that for a long time. I thought about a little blue-gray child chasing a foil bird across a cargo deck, and a tired old man who got between her and death without weighing the cost, and I thought about what she must carry now. Every time she looks at some new species and asks the old question, is this worth preserving? I think she already knows the answer. I think she learned it when she was 5, underneath a stranger who kept all of it and gave her nothing, who curled around her like a wall and a shell and told her SHH. I think she looks at every living thing now and waits to see what's underneath. And I think, when she finds it, that thing that reaches for the child, I think she knows exactly what she's found. Because a man showed it to her once. And she never let go of it. Not once.